Welcome. Hi, I'm Derek Davis, coach of Alief Kerr's debate team and the Green Debate Team. We welcome you today to the fourth in a series of TPS debates sponsored by the UN Foundation. We're pleased to have a visiting team, Alief Taylor High School, coached by Tarek Brown, and we welcome their participation in these great events.
Result: when it cannot do both, the United Nations should prioritize global poverty reduction over combating climate change. We offer the following definitions in order to clarify this debate. From Merriam-Webster's dictionary: climate change, the reduction or increase of climate within the Earth's atmosphere. Observation 1. Poverty and environmental destruction are factors which are a part of a perpetual cycle. The eradication of any one factor will inevitably do nothing to stop the continuity of the cycle. Furthermore, as long as nothing is done, the cycle will always continue, and more importantly, it will eventually worsen. And like any cycle, when you eradicate one component, the other component no longer exists. Thus, the essence of today's debate is to determine which component should be reduced and eradicated before the other. Upon making this decision, we must consider which method would be the most effective, least time-consuming, and most importantly, the method that is most pragmatic. Contention 1, poverty can't be effectively reduced by itself. Anna Shaw, Global Issues, March 22, 2K9. Is it enough to blame poor people for their own predicament? Have they been lazy, made poor decisions, and been solely responsible for their plight? Such causes of poverty and inequality are no doubt real, but deeper and more global causes of poverty are often less discussed. The poorest are also typically marginalized from society and have little representation or voice in public and political debates, making it even harder to escape poverty. Around the world, in rich or poor nations, poverty has always been present. The causes are numerous, including a lack of individual responsibility, bad government policy, exploitation by people and businesses with power and influence, or some combination of these and other factors. The latest World Bank figures poverty reveals a higher number of people live in poverty than previously thought. For example, the new poverty line is defined as living on the equivalent of $1.25 a day, with the measure based on the latest data available. 1.4 billion people live on or below that line. Furthermore, almost half of the world's over 3 billion people live on less than $2.50 a day, and at least 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. Poverty is engraved into society and cannot be effectively reduced by itself. There is no single root cause to poverty because there is a variety of circumstances that exist. In order to effectively reduce poverty, the UN would have to pass billions of pieces of legislation, each pertaining to a specific circumstance that may occur. Attempting to reduce poverty is plainly not effective because it cannot be permanently or effectively controlled by any piece of legislation or regulation. Contention 2, solving for climate change is the most pragmatic solution. Dr. Rijam Argwal, Department of Economics, Southern Methodist University. Without a healthy planet Earth, all life would not exist. In a situation like this, both the rich and the poor would be suffering from lack of resources on Earth. When comparing environmental protection to poverty, it can be clearly seen that the environment can be controlled much more easily than poverty. The most important aspect of weighing the two comes into play when we are considering the pragmatic methods towards environmental protection. Addressing environmental protection would mean regulating and mandating human actions, which is extremely possible. But on the other hand, there is no simple pragmatic solution towards poverty reduction because it will require economic growth in countries and societal maturity, all of which the UN is absolutely incapable of successfully doing. Fixing the ordeals caused by environmental destruction will happen within a reasonable time frame because you can simply regulate carbon emission or mandate the decrease of use of natural resources and see results the following year. But in the story of poverty, the UN is incapable of passing any legislation that could effectively reduce poverty globally, since there is no specific root cause to this. In conclusion, it can be clearly seen that prioritizing climate change over global poverty reduction will always outweigh. The negative approach is more pragmatic and practical solution than a global poverty reduction. Environmental protection inherently outweighs global poverty reduction in the amount of people it affects, the amount of time that it will take to eradicate the problem, and most importantly, the probability of solving. For these reasons, we urge the judge to vote con.
Dr. Seuss once said in Horton Hears a Who that a person's a person no matter how small. Seuss attaches, as he should, inherent and intrinsic value to the human person, meaning that every human being has natural dignity and should be treated with respect, fairness, and equality. However, when one takes a look at our modern world, one quickly sees how the poor have been stripped of nearly every basic human and civil right. Before we move on, note that the resolution requires one side to choose sustaining poverty in the name of protecting the environment, and that the logistics of each option does not matter because of should in the resolution, allowing teams to weigh the arguments through a moral and logical lens. Therefore, because my partner and I believe that the UN should reduce global poverty, we stand in affirmation resolved. When it cannot do both, the UN should prioritize poverty reduction over combating climate change. We will define key terms for this debate. When it cannot do both means that when both cannot be done at the same time. The United Nations means an international organization whose aims are facilitating cooperation in international law, international security, and economic deployment, social progress, human rights, and world peace. Prioritize means to discuss about which objects to treat when involving a comparison of different views of urgency. Contention 1, from rags to riches. The UN's goals focuses mainly on the reduction of global poverty. It is noted that UNICEF and the Census Bureau estimates that 25,000 children die daily because of poverty. They die quietly in some of the poorest villages on earth, far removed from the scrutiny and the conscience of the world. Being meek and weak in life makes these dying multitudes even more invisible in death. Every 3.5 seconds, or in my 4-minute speech, 68 children will have died, and by the end of this debate round, 531, just because of the lack of basic needs and food, resources, shelter, and money. The dignity of the human person should be held over the protection of the environment because of the moral obligation presented. James Gilligan, professor of psychiatry at Harvard and the director of the study of violence, notes that the deadliest form of violence is poverty. Poverty is a form of structural violence that is equivalent to an ongoing nuclear war against the poor. It is also the root cause to all other forms of violence and destruction. Living in poverty means living a pretty wretched experience. Poor individuals often do not learn how to read or write, are exposed to diseases that they often die from due to lack of health resources, are frequently exploited to human traffickers, and often engage in hard labor for almost no return. To argue that we should ignore the impacts of being poor when there are conflicting environmental demands is reprehensible. Do not let the con claim that they still agree that living in poverty should be solved, then go back and claim that the environment is more important. The values presented to other nations spill and influence other countries. Contention 2, the poverty paradox. One cannot expect a poverty-stricken nation to have significant enough resources to protect the environment, least of all mere survival. By raising those who are poor to a higher standard of living, one actually aids in protecting the environment. What happens when people are more educated about farming and have learned about sustainable agriculture? They, of course, use this newfound knowledge. In order to reach these levels of sophistication, in order to maintain an economy of the likes we are discussing, the UN must first act in reducing poverty, thereby setting an example for other nations inside but not limited to the UN Charter. In developing countries, some 2.5 billion people are forced to rely on fossil fuels to meet their energy needs for cooking. The Millennium Development Goals report in 2007 notes that in sub-Saharan Africa, over 80% of the population depends on traditional fossil fuels, as do over half of the populations of India and China. The obvious historical example proves that impoverished nations are reduced to the bare minimum of life, meaning that they simply can't protect the environment unless their way of life is altered first. In conclusion, the UN is not required to solve the problem of global poverty, merely to prioritize it over environmental protection. The priority of the issues is crystal clear, for a person's a person no matter how small. And the UN, we must protect these people, but most of all, these children from the horrific fate that awaits them if change is not made. Therefore, we urge you to vote pro.
Ready? Why should we sustain poverty?
Well, in your case, you talk about how we can't really reduce poverty, and that so we should look to protecting the environment. But the problem is, poverty is actually one of the causes of environmental damage. So if we were to reduce poverty, not only do we help people, which is a moral obligation that we should have, that we do have, but we also help to eliminate the environmental damage. Okay. In your contention too, you talked about regulating and mandating human actions in order to help environmental protection. What are your plans? Like, how do you propose we do this?
Well, there are many examples, but one of these may be, like I stated in my second contention, which is the reduction of using natural resources or putting a cap on carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. In your first contention, you talk about how poverty has caused people to die, but do you realize that the destruction of environment and climate change has caused many people to die as well?
Well, it's not really certain if it's the destruction of the environment, but like there are statistics saying that it is poverty.